Hello and welcome to the next session of the world of poetry. Today we will discuss about the great poem by Kalidas, Bhartri and Bhavbhuti. And the title of the poem Is Poetry Always Worthy When It's Old? As we all can see that the title of the poem is a question. What is the meaning of the title? That is poetry always worthy when it's old? This poem is actually a compile of the small stanzas by Kalidas, Bhavbhuti and the Bhartri. The poets are the great Sanskrit poets, the great and renowned Sanskrit poets. They belong to the Sanskrit literature. The first stanza which we discuss in this poem, that is written by Kalidas. Accordingly, the first stanza is begin with the same question: is poetry worthy when it's old? And it is worthless, and because it's new. Reader, decide yourself if it is the true. Fools suspend judgment, waiting to be told. Now, what Kalidas said? He asked a question to the readers. Actually, this poem is a comment on the critics. The critics who criticize the poetry. What is the concept of these poets that they try to convince the critics that this is not a good job to criticize the poets and the poetry on the basis of their own concern, whether or which poetry is the good and which poetry is the worthful and which is the worthless. So that he asked the question, is poetry worthy when it's old? I think we can compare the poem actually with Jonathan Swift's Battle of the Books, if you remember. In this book, Swift has compared the writers between the modern writing and the ancient writing. And according to the modern writer Swift, ancient writings are best and the moderns are the imitators. So similarly, Kalidas has also described the same thing, that even critics have no right to decide that which poetry is worthy and worthful, rather because the concept of the poetry is always worthful, whether it's old or it's new. It doesn't matter. As we can see that literature is the mirror of the society. So how can we say that this is the good for us and this is the bad for us? Because everything which has been written by the poets, by the fiction writers, novelists, dramatists, everything they have written in their time according to their circumstances, according to their time they are living in. So that the Kalidas has begin this first quarter as is poetry always worthy when it's old, and is it worthless then because it's new? And in the next line he said that let the readers decide it by themselves. He said that let the critics be dumb from their mouth. They have no right to interpret that which poetry is worthy and which is worthless. So he said that let the readers decide. Why? What is the reason that Kalidas has given this opportunity to the readers? Because only readers can decide according to their senses, according to their taste of reading, according to their learned conditions. Only they can judgment that which poetry is useful or worthful for them and which is worthless for them. Because in the last line he said, who suspend judgment, waiting to be told? Only those people who have no sense of judgment, who have no sense of understand the poetry and the senses, the emotions, the feelings of the poet, only those people will suspend the judgment that which poetry is worthful and which is worthless. Only those will deny to give the judgment on the poetry. And they need the criticism, they need the critics to decide that which poetry is the worthy and which is worthless. So actually, the way the poem is written, the worldly, we never have seen that this poem is against the criticism, while the real concept of the poem is that each and every poet is addressing to the critics that why the critics have decided that what they have written is good or bad, is worthless or worthful. It's not their task, because whatever a writer has, whatever there should be written by a writer, that thing is written for some purpose. Only the learned people can decide that it is worthful or the worthless. In the next stanza, another poet said, if learned critics publicly deride my work, well, let them deride. The word is here used by the poet, publicly deride, publicly ignorant, unnegotiated, learned critics. He said learned critics, not the learned readers. He said learned critics. If they publicly deride it, let them. If these critics, if these scholar critics denied their poem, deride their poem and move on, my work, Bhabhuti's work, let them do. Because Bhabhuti's writing is not for the critics, but for his readers. And he expects that one day a man shall live to share my thought, for time is endless and the world is wide. He said that he is hopeful for this endless world, this infinite world, that a man, a human being, a man, because generation to generation, poetry is immortal. He said that poetry is an immortal thing. It is forever. It is endless, and no one can put harm to his thoughts, his poetry, his lyrics, his verses, whatever he has written in his poetry. It is endless thing. It is a thing for forever. So that he said that he is ready to wait for a man who would be able to understand that what is written by Bhabhuti in his poetry. In the next stanza, Bhabhuti compares. The poet has used here metaphor. He said in this stanza, he compared the thoughts of the poem and an arrow, warrior's arrow, and the poet's poetry. He said that of what use is the poet's poem, of what use is the bowman's dust, unless another sense reels, when it sticks squaring in the heart. He said that poetry is very much like the dart arrow of the bowman. Dart is an arrow. He said it's like an arrow stretched by the bowman, by a warrior. He said because both have stretched for, written for the same purpose. That poetry is worthless which is unable to move the senses and feelings of the reader. And that arrow is worthless which unable to hit the heart of the enemy. So similarly, the poet is metaphorically compare the poetry with an arrow, with the bow of the bowman. So that the same thing is described by Bhabhuti here, like Kalidasa he said, that let the people who read them, who are their common readers. Let them decide what kind of their poems are. Let the critics be dumb. Let the critics be moved from their way and stop judgment on their poetry. That their poetry belongs to the ancient time or their poetry belongs to the modern time, and which poetry is worthless and which is worthful. So he said that let the readers be decided. Similarly, in the next stanza, the poet used the word scoundrel for the critics itself. He said scoundrels are about the wit to fit. A word or two of verse together are daunted not a wish to sit in judgment on the abstruse poetry of another. He said that let these scoundrels people, these critics who have not a bit of knowledge about the poetry, sometimes they try to pretend themselves to be a poet, try to add some or one or two lines with each other without having any imagination. Wit is an imagination. Without having any imagination, try to manage them, try to fit them with the rhyme scheme and try to add some one or two words with each other, and daunted not a whit to sit in judgment on the abstruse poetry of another. And when these kind of poet critics sit on some place and try to hear the poetry of any poet, then they will not sit there to understand the senses of the poet, while they sit there to try to create some problem, try to create some kind of fault in the poetry of the poet. Such men will listen with attentive mind, see how many faults they find. Truly, as I have expressed it, I have told it before, the poet said that these people will not listen or hear the poet's poetry with attentive, though they listen with attentive mind, but their concept of that attention is not for the appreciation, is not for the perceptive concept, while they hear them attentively, as because of they try to find out the fault in the poet's poem. As if they are vexed because they fail to grasp the sense. What is conceived for readers of intelligence? Naturally, they blame their foolishness. They will not blame their foolishness like a girl who's less perfect always blames the dress. Now the poet compares these people who are unable to understand the sense of the poet's poem, who are unable to understand the real point, the real senses, the real feeling of the poetry, and not ready to accept this thought that they are unable to understand, while they blaming the poet at that time that the poet is not good, his poetry is worthless, and so many other things, etc. So the poet is compared such kind of poet critics with that girl. He is using again the metaphor here. He said that these poet critics are like that girl who is less perfect, who is ugly in looking, the girl who is not beautiful. But whenever she wears any dress, she will not blame to herself that she is not beautiful, while she always blames her dress, that her dress is not good. So similarly, these poet critics are not blaming themselves. They will not blame themselves that it is the fault is in their mind, that they are unable to understand what the poet is saying. But they always blame the poet that his poetry is not good. In the next stanza, the poet Bhabhuti is described how the human life must go on, how we spend our life we the human beings, spent our lives in a common way, in a general way, that each and every human being goes with the same process of life. And how can they judge the people in such a short span of time? This is what the reason behind this quotation. He said that a man lives long who lives 100 years, yet half is asleep and half the rest again. Old age and childhood. He said that basically a human age is considered as 100 years. And from these 100 years, a man has spent half of his age in sleeping, that is childhood, and half the rest again, that is old age. For the rest, a man lives close companions to disease and tears, losing his love, working for other men, and rest of the time, that is the young age, he spent in remorse, in lovelorn feelings, in complaints, in so many other troubles and rivalries of life, and they concern about their love, about their professional life, about their disease, about their companions. So many things is going on in their mind in their young age, while the childhood and the old age they have spent in sleeping and rest. And the time which is actually the young age is the time when they try to give so many time to reveal their senses, to move their life in a move on way. Where can joy find a space in this short span? He said that actually a man have no time to spend his life with joy, with happiness, because almost time they have spent in sleeping, in resting, or in concerning about the others, in remorses, in rivalries, and complaints. So where's the time for the joy, for the happiness? Again, he is commenting to the critic, the poet critic, that stop criticizing others. If this time, if you have an age, if you have some learned mind, then use it in some worthful task. Rather, criticize the other people. Now, the last stanza, which is written by the great Sanskrit poet Bhartrhari, he compared the situation of a poet critic with a married woman, with a wife, a complaining of a wife. He said that the relationship between a poet and a poet critic is like a husband and wife. The wife who lives far from her husband, and when her husband comes to her for some time, and after that he had to go again. So, what is the condition of the wife at that time? So she asked so many exclamatory questions that I could say, but this is inauspicious. Do not go. That how to stop my husband to you. Kaise roku? How to stop? Do not go. I could say, but this is inauspicious. If I said, the wife said that if I said that, do not go, it's inauspicious. It's not good for you. It's not worthful. It's quite commanding, quite ordering. I can't order you to do not go. Similarly, the poet critic can't stop a poet to write something. They can't stop them. They can't prevent them. Do not write. Because poets are made for the writing. All right, go is the loveliest thing to say. If the wife said that it's okay, you can go. You just go. No problem. It's nothing to worry for me. Like a loveless thing. So again, a poet critic can't say a poet to, okay, write whatever you want to write, because it's again a known prevention activity for them. Stay with me is imperious. A critic can't live with a poet. So he said that, the wife said that it would be very imperious if she said imperious is it's quite a selfishness that if I said that, stay with me. Do as you wish, so just cold indifference. And if I say I'll die when you are gone, you might or might not believe me. So this is the condition of a wife who lives far, who lives separate from her husband, and when her husband comes to her, she try to pretend to stop him. But as because of husband will left her to move on another place for for his services, for his professional work, whatever. But she wants to live with him. She wants his company, but she has no words, no emotions, even no feelings. But how to stop him to stay with her? Teach me, my husband, what I ought to say when you go away. So this is the question of the poet to the poet critic, that how can we stop you? Because if we write about this, you will criticize us. If we write it in that manner, then you will criticize us. Then how to write? Actually, their condition is like that wife who still don't know that how to stop her husband to go far from her. So this is the point where poets are describe about the criticism of the poetry, is the world of the poetry, and they try to stop them. That poetry is a kind of thing, the poetry is a kind of writing which actually let readers be decide them, that which poetry is worthy for them, which poetry is worthless for them. It's not the critics to create their concepts and misguide the readers. It's not a good thing for the critics to misguide the readers. Let them decide which writing is good for them. So, let me describe you that the poem is about criticism on the poet and the poetry. Every poet is trying to comment on the critic. They have no sense of understand the learned poems. In spite of all, they blame the poet and their writing. The poet is very clear